Hey everyone, it is Grandmaster Josh Friedel. Um, had a bunch going on, but I am back to videos hopefully more regularly again. I know it's a vague promise, but hopefully I'll get back to it. In any case, I wanted to show you. I got inspired to kind of do this one from watching the Cairns Cup taking place in St. Louis. Before I get started, I want to mention my second Chessable course has been out for a bit, and you can check it out. I'll provide a link in the description to the video. But if you're interested, it's on middle games. It's aimed at beginners, but intermediate players can also definitely benefit from it, I would say. On the lower spectrum of intermediate players, definitely can find it challenging. So I'll provide links in the description and all of this. So that was been cool. All right. Otherwise, let us begin. So this was the game between Alice Lee and Nana Dzagnidze. Really fascinating game. There are lots of cool games from that event. If you're checking it out, I definitely recommend it. And this endgame occurred, and this endgame was really fascinating here. So part of this, and I always kind of do a like a warning for these kind of things because I really always have to point out that playing a game is so much harder than watching it. And when you're playing, you're in a moment, you have the clock running. It's very difficult. So when I'm kind of critical or I would do something else, it's not necessarily that like players are weak. It's regardless of what games I'm watching, really, it's more just that in the moment it's much harder to make correct decisions. And I think one of the keys is to really practice as much as you can doing things like this, because then if you get in the moment and you've had more practice, you have at least a better shot at doing it. But definitely, I'm going to mention my thoughts as I was watching, because I happened to be able to watch this endgame kind of unfold a bit. And it was this position, and I think that Alice still had some time, although both players definitely didn't have tons of time here. And I remember seeing this position, and Alice actually immediately played a particular move. And I actually wanted to pause here and see what you guys would do, because I think this is a great position to pause. You have a very clear choice here. You can take the pawn on f4, the pawn on h4. I'll let you think about it, and then I'll talk about the position. So, yeah, and again, you can always pause the video and do stuff like that if you want to use it to train. In any case, I think that there are many hurdles to clear when you're calculating a position in endgame like this. Endgame calculation works very differently than other types of calculation. One of the big differences is that there's like a bit more knowledge factored in. So if you don't know anything about endgames, it's much harder to calculate them because you don't know what positions you're aiming for, what positions you don't. So getting knowledge of basic endgames, like knowing king and pawn against king, things like that, is really important. Whether it's a draw, whether it's not, etc., is incredibly important. Also, you have to calculate like you would in a normal position. Calculation can be a bit different. Sometimes you actually have to calculate a longer line, especially in king and pawn endgames. Other times, calculation just looks slightly different. And the other thing you have to factor in are the idea of zugzwang. Zugzwang can occur in a middle game. Zugzwang being meaning that you put your opponent in a situation where they have to make a bad move. They have no good move. But in endgames, it occurs quite frequently. So one of the common questions to ask is, do I pass the move to the opponent? Things like this. In any case, the main option between capturing each pawn is actually a difficult one. Alice immediately took on f4 very quickly, and I was a bit surprised by this. It is possible she thought she was just drawing, because she has a tactic there. There is a trick involved, which is rather important. So, but I think that the best move is actually knight takes h4, and this is what I for sure thought she would do. But she immediately took on f4, and I assumed I actually had blundered something, that I missed that she has, that she has a forced draw in a sense. And part of this, like I said, is knowledge. And I'm sure that Alice knows this, but after king takes h4, rook takes f4, check, king g3, for example, you get rook and bishop against rook. Let's say you play like rook f7. Now, rook and bishop against rook is not a sure draw by any means. It is very difficult to draw. If you don't know how to play it, it's really hard to draw. But it is a technically drawn position, and this should be the choice if your alternatives are losing. Now, if you can try to find a draw that saves you the suffering here, that is almost certainly better. So I can understand not going for this if you think you can draw another way. But I do think that aiming for this was the most pragmatic. Now, one thing to point out is black doesn't actually have to take the knight. Black could try to go here. And then you actually have to be very, very careful. To give you an idea, there's only one good move here for white. And the question is, what move might that be? So it's actually very important you play the knight to f5, which looks very strange. But the idea is if you play knight g6 and I play f3, you have a problem. The bishop's coming to g3. If you try to play king f2, I can play bishop a7 check, and your king gets forced back. I get in like check and f2. You're going to have a whole problem. So this position is actually really, really bad, and this is not a draw. First of all, you lose immediately, but even if you didn't, having to play passive defense against this is not a good idea. So you actually have to play to f5. And even here, there's some trickiness. For example, black probably plays here, and now you actually play knight h6 check. And the idea is that, for example, if king f3, you run with your king. And the idea is that eventually your knight will be able to sack for this pawn, and you'll get rook and bishop against rook, right, to have to hold, is the idea. But this is by no means like super easy, but it's definitely, I think, the correct approach. There's all sorts of other tricky things, like black can also play king back to g5. And once again, you actually have to make a very, very tricky choice. So again, here's maybe another nice test for you. Which square do you move the rook to? Your main choices are c6 and a6. So which choice do you think you should make? Keep in mind your king and rook and knight are attacked. You don't have a ton of options. So this is where the details really, really matter. These positions are all about details. It looks relatively simple with not many pieces on the board. I think the biggest mistake people make is assuming these endgames are not complicated. So the biggest thing here is that the rook on c6 looks just as good as a6. The problem is it doesn't cover a key square. Now if I play f3, for example, if you try to play king f2, I have this move bishop a7 check, and this is simply winning. If king g3, for example, I check. And here you actually have a very nasty move, rook g3. So if the idea is if takes, then you get a queen. So this is actually losing for that reason. But white can try this check. And this is actually relatively tricky. But the general idea is black can move up with the king. If you try to check here, I can go here. And again, you have a back rank problem that is quite severe. Like my rook will eventually slide over and try to go after your king. So you really should instead play check. But now I can play, for example, king g4, and if knight h6 check, king g5. And once again, I've kind of gotten an f3 for free. So if your rook moves, I have stuff like bishop g3, trying to bring the rook in. It's still like have some work to do, but I think that black is doing quite well there. So it's actually very important you go to a6, and the idea now is that after f3 you can simply play king f2, and this is a great move to have in. You're threatening like knight f6 check, knight f7 checks probably played next, and the idea is if the king ever goes to f4, you can play rook a4 check. So for example, let's say, I'm not sure. So first of all, the bishop actually needs a square, which isn't the easiest thing. But let's say if king f4 immediately, the key is that you have this check, and you don't allow the rook to check you back, you don't get passive, and you'll be able to pick up the f3 pawn at some point. So while it was no means, I certainly didn't see any of this when I was calculating this position. Maybe Alice actually got scared off of this. We'll never know. Because I assume she calculated before. It wasn't like she made the decision instantly just because she calculates like that fast. I'm sure it was she thought about it before Nana played her move. But yeah, knight takes h4 I think was definitely the way to go. Again, it requires, first of all, the knowledge. You have to know that rook against rook and bishop is a draw. And then you have to calculate the lines. And here there's not as much of the third part. We will definitely get to the third part. But Alice chose rook takes f4, which is actually kind of a cool move, because after king g3, it looks at first like she's blundered. So first of all, if rook takes h4, rook takes f3 check, you do not get rook and bishop against rook, because here black can simply check and then take the rook. That would be bad news. And if you allow rook takes f3 check, you are not drawing. So first of all, this brings us to the point of the knowing the drawing thing. If the king gets here, it's a draw because it's the wrong colored bishop. That's something you have to know. Again, we're talking about knowledge. But because the bishop cuts the king off, you can't actually get there, and this is a fairly simple win. So, moving backwards, knight d2 was Alice's big idea. And this is a very clever move. You're attacking the rook. And if the rook were to move, you have ideas like rook f3 check, rook d3. You cut the king off, you should be able to hold. So this is a really, really neat idea. But unfortunately for Alice, there is a flaw to it. And Nana, to her credit, spotted it right away. She takes and puts the pawn on h3. And my guess would be, if I had to guess where Alice messed it up a little bit, it's that she assumed that this position was easier to draw than it is, or something like that. But the problem is that the king cannot approach. If it ever moves away, the h-pawn queen. So the king is kind of glued to f1. And then black's plan is going to be to try to play king g3 or king f3 followed by h2. But knights are very pesky pieces, in case I haven't mentioned it already. Knights are very pesky. That's why I decided to call this video that, even though it's a kind of weird title. But hey, so controlling a knight in an endgame is actually very, very challenging. And this is where we come to our calculation and how it works. So in the game, Alice played knight d2. I actually think knight c1 might even be a better try. And I'll get to that in a moment. Actually, I'll get to that first. So knight c1. So the reason I think it's a better try is because you have squares that can immediately check the king. It's not necessarily like clearly better for any other reason, but and again, they're all losing. You know, I have the benefit of having checked all of this. So the key here is, how do you calculate a position like this? So number one, you have your knowledge, right? So the knowledge is that if the king gets to h1, it's a draw, regardless of what happens to your knight. So if the king gets to h1, it's a draw. If black gets a queen, regardless of what happens, you lose. That's kind of obvious. So next comes calculation. So forcing moves in the endgame are very challenging, but they still matter. In this position, black has various forcing moves. Forcing moves, there are really two. What's funny is a move like bishop e3 looks like a forcing move, but it is not, because you're not threatening to take the knight. If you take the knight, I get my king to h1. So bishop e3 does not count as a forcing move. I know this seems kind of like I'm being very nitpicky, but it's actually really important you think about positions in this way, because otherwise they're going to be too unmanageable. So the main tempo moves here are king g3 and king f3. The main one I would calculate is the move king f3. The reason for that is because it makes the immediate threat of h2, and the knight cannot check it. If king g3, you allow knight e2 check. And king going to h2 does not do you any favors. If you play king h1, h2, you're achieving nothing. I just move the knight around until the end of time, basically. And as long as I don't get it trapped on like b1 with a bishop on b4, it's going to be a very easy draw. Oops, sorry. So knight b3. So here, the move bishop e3, I think, is quite good. But here, once again, you have to be very, very careful. And the reason for that is because... So first of all, you have to calculate the forcing move first. Let me do this. So I'm going to show you how to do it the first time, and then as we go through the Alice line, I'll actually pause and have you do it. So h2 is the first move you have to look at, right? Why is it the first move? Because it's a tempo move. You're threatening h1 queen. Fair enough. So what moves does white have? Knight d4 check doesn't work. You must play knight d2 check. So once again, the king can only go to... If the king gets to g2, you know it's a draw. So you must play here. Only one move, knight check. If the king goes back, you can go back. So you can't allow king g2. You must play here. Knight check. You have to go back. You know it's a draw. Easy enough, right? But it's very, very important that you see this. So h2 cannot be played until you're absolutely certain your king can't get checked to death. So bishop e3 looks like a very natural move to contain the knight. The problem is it doesn't actually fully contain the knight as much as you think. It looks like this just wins on the spot. The knight moves like any kind of lame square, you play h2. If the king moves, you play h2. H2 is even a pretty healthy threat here. But you have knight d2 check. Once again, you cannot take the knight because you know the king gets over. The question is, how do you win this position? And this is actually quite a cool idea. So pause your video, try to see if you can figure out how black would win here. So the most obvious move is the move king g3, right? Try to, again, support h2. The problem is I play knight e4 check, and you're kind of stuck with your king. If you try to come up, for example, I play knight f2, and this is a draw. If you push the pawn, you know I go here. I don't care if you take my knight ever. I have access to the pawn. If you let me take the pawn, you know it's a draw. And if you take the knight, this should also be in your memory banks as a drawn position. Very easy to draw against the h-pawn in general. And if you go back, obviously white can check you again, but the actual much better move is knight g5 check. And the idea is that if you allow captures of the pawn, it's a draw, so you must take, and then the king gets to h1, and it is a draw. This is the kind of thing that the more you practice it, the quicker and more efficient you will become. But it's very easy to limit that. So the move that is stronger is actually the king f4. So this much is easy enough to see. The knight can't move to e4 or f3. You can't move the king because of h2. The only move that really does anything is the move knight c4. If you try to play a move like knight b3, for example, I play king g3, and then you're already prepared to play h2. This actually would transpose to another line, but we'll get to that in a moment. So the move knight c4, and this is where it gets very tricky. So if you didn't find it, you can pause again. But this is actually very cool. You win with the move king g3. Once again, if you're following our rules, apart from h2, which immediately draws, it is the most forcing move in the position. You are threatening the move h2. White might as well take the bishop. There's nothing better. If they try something like knight d6, for instance, I can play h2 here, knight check, king here, and notice how the bishop controls both squares. So this is a very common pattern to look out for. The bishop controls both squares, and you're ready to queen. So this does not work. So knight takes e3, and then h2, and the idea is that the only square to check is here. You play king here, and you're going to get a queen, which will easily defeat the knight. So very, very cool, these lines. I really enjoy endgames like this. I find that they're quite fascinating, but learning how to defeat the knight is one of the hardest things to try to figure out. Because it's so hard to calculate, it's hopping everywhere, and that's why you have to make it manageable by having kind of a clear system as far as like, okay, these are the things I cannot allow due to your knowledge, right? Like, okay, I can't allow the king to h1, I can't allow this, and then there are only so many squares the knight can go. And one nice thing with the knight is that it cannot lose a tempo. Knights cannot lose tempi, and what that means is that you can zugzwang them pretty easily, because a bishop and a king can both lose tempi. Kings can triangulate, is a very common way to lose a tempo with a king, and bishops can just like go blah blah blah, right? Like, you know, move back and forth in different ways and easily lose a tempo, right? So you can actually take advantage of the knight in this way. So this move was played. So here, Dzagnidze played bishop d4, which is fine. Bishop e3 is still winning with the idea of knight c4, king g3. I'm guessing this was missed. Low on time, end of a pressure game. Not the easiest thing to see, even with time, and it's not the easiest thing. So Dzagnidze played bishop d4, which is still fine. Does not blow the win in any way. Alice plays knight here. And now black plays king g3. Once again, a tempo move, threatening the move h2. So Alice decides to threaten a check, very important. So the first question, once again, is does the move h2 win? So if you want to pause and ask, does the move h2 win? The answer is no, because, if you play h2 here, I play knight e4 check, and we have the same pattern, right? You cannot allow the king to g2 ever, right? I don't know why my thing's not working. And if king here, check. If you go back, no matter what you do, I just keep checking you, and eventually I will get to g2. You need your bishop on e3 to control this knight. That's why you put it there in all these lines. So instead, Dzagnidze plays the move king f3. So the move knight f7, I actually think is maybe a more clever defense, believe it or not. Alice played knight f5, which we'll get to in a moment. And here, I think that Dzagnidze has to go back to f4. And that's kind of a hard thing to see. Notice how, once again, h2, knight g5 check is a draw. So you have to go back. And now you can put the bishop on e3 and win this way. So, you know, the same idea. White can play knight f7, which is a little different. Notice how knight c4, king g3 again. Knight f7 is a bit different, but then there's king g3. Notice how the bishop controls the knight very nicely here. And it's kind of funny because it doesn't directly control it. If you play the move knight g5, I can't take your knight. If I take your knight, then king g1 is a draw. Oops, sorry. Where was I? Goodness gracious. I play h2. And the idea is that, because I had to, right? The pawn was attacked. And now you're covering g2. And again, if knight e4 check, you have this. And you control these squares. Very important. I should mention that this move looks very nice. But then you have to deal with moves like knight f2. And you feel kind of silly. So I think it might still even win here. I didn't check this, I'll be honest. But something like king, oops, sorry. King here, check, and here, and you're on Zugzwang. Yeah, I think so. I think, because here, this is the thing, like that. Now it's getting dicey, because if king here, this is definitely a draw. So the point is you should not allow this, right? Like, why are we doing this? So yeah, h2, and this is a very nice way to win. And if knight d6, this is actually really cool. So there's king f3. So if knight f5, bishop b6 is actually kind of similar, we'll see that. So knight c4, h2, and then knight d2 check is a really crazy defense. This is very, very difficult to see. The idea being that if you capture the knight, it's actually a stalemate, very embarrassingly. And this is the thing, when you're calculating, you have to make sure you look at all the tempo moves. Make sure you're indeed covering the knight. You'll notice so many positions, it looks like you're preventing the knight from moving to a square, but you are not. So calculating it in a disciplined manner is really important. But instead, black can do the same idea. Put the king on h3, and the knight is very well controlled. So in the game, Alice played here. And now is your chance to find a win for black. So it's black to play. How would you like to try to win here? So once again, pause your video. So of course you look at your tempo moves first. The move h2 is the most forcing move. However, knight takes d4 check, king g3, you have to control g2. And then very importantly, you don't play knight f5 check, which would lose. You play knight e2 check. And now you can continue to check the king. You can even go to g1 if you want to be particularly annoying. And then do this. And that's a dead draw. So the correct move is a move like bishop e7. You could play bishop c5, bishop b6. I like bishop on a7. It's nice and out of the way. So once again, h2 is a threat. You must thwart in some way. So white will play knight h4 check. And then the key here is you play king g4, attacking the knight. Knight g6, king g3. So I want you to notice that in this position, you actually have a position where you're putting white in Zugzwang. You're basically saying that after bishop a7, you just do not have a good move. You can't move your king, and you have no good move with your knight. This is the kind of key thing where you sort of run the knight out of moves. And this is a nice triangulation, because if you go to g3, I have knight f5 check. But if you go here, and now king here, h2 is unstoppable. You can try knight e7, but I play h2. King h3, and that's all she wrote. One funny thing to note is that in this position, knight g2 is a legal move. King g3 I think wins as well, but this is kind of nice. Nice pattern. You could play h2 if the king cannot have access, and the key is just after knight e3 check, you do not capture it, you play king f3. And h1 is unstoppable. So bishop to a7 or bishop b6 or bishop c5, all of these do the job. Instead, Dzagnidze played bishop f2, which once again looks logical because there's no stalemate, of course, and the idea is that you're corralling the knight. The question is, what did she miss? If you didn't spot it, feel free to pause again and see what you think. But Alice definitely spotted it. One thing that she's really great at is seeing her chances. If you give her any kind of tactical chance, she will definitely take it. She does, and she also doesn't really give up very easily. A lot of players have that, but she definitely is very good in that way, and it's definitely a quality that you want to have. So The key thing is she has to move knight h4 check. Remember I talked about the bishop, the phantom defense of a square. The bishop's not actually defending that square. And here, for sure, Nana realized her mistake. So after king g3, for example, the knight can just go back. You might even have knight f3 to be really obnoxious, to use the stalemate. But knight f5 check is simplest, and then you have to go back and forth. So Dzagnidze took, Alice put her king on h1, and they agreed to a draw. So a really, really fascinating endgame. You'll notice how complicated it is. Just because there aren't many pieces and there aren't many direct threats does not mean the endgame is not complicated. Notice how at the beginning, really you should aim for the rook and bishop against rook. Even if it's hard to defend, it definitely is the correct way in this case. You saw how dangerous that position is because the knight has to hop around, and it's much easier to zugzwang a knight than it is a lot of other pieces because it cannot lose a tempo, and we saw how that really mattered in the end. And then the key is to how to structure your calculation. So the very important points are you make sure that have your knowledge in place. You know what endgames you can shoot for, which ones you cannot. You know the result of, kind of gather whatever knowledge you have. If you don't know it, it's okay. It just means you have to calculate more. Then it's the question of calculating the forcing moves. Forcing moves in an endgame can be a little different, but they still exist, whether it's pushing a pawn, threatening to queen, attacking a piece, what have you. And then there's the looking at the position and asking yourself, does my opponent have a way to improve a piece? Do they have any improving moves here? If they don't, oftentimes zugzwanging them, running them out of moves is a really great method. But definitely it's one of the big steps in positions like this is do not assume they are simple because there aren't many pieces. Some of the most complex positions in chess have very few pieces. For a table base, it's not a problem. For computers and table base, it's not a problem. For a human being, these positions are amazingly complex. I cannot tell you how much it drives me nuts when people are like, oh, they blundered those fish. Like, first of all, these players are almost certainly better than you are. And also, it's really hard to play endgames like this accurately. They're very complicated. So I hope you got to appreciate that a bit. Once again, if you're interested in my Chessable courses, there is a link below to both of them. And also, if you like these videos, I've been getting a lot of support. I really appreciate it. But liking the video, subscribing, it's totally free, and it definitely helps me out and encourages me to do more. So once again, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.